The U.S. Army held a press conference on August 31st to say there will likely be no adverse impacts from depleted uranium at the Pohakuloa training area. Members of the media were invited onto the PTA firing range, where officials disclosed the results of a recent basic human health risk assessment of DU at the location.
They are orders of magnitude well below what the EPA and NRC considers to be a risk to either humans or the environment. So what we're coming out to do today is basically give you that report and show you what the levels came out to be and how they were so low.
The assessment was conducted in partnership with the Hawaii Department of Health and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The Army says no DU is present outside the impact area.
Some sort of red boundary, that's our impact area. Anytime, so we're firing in all the heavy ordnance into here, and those are typically, no man land. We don't let people in those areas, except for, scheduled maintenance of targets and things like that. Outside of that, you've got another area. This is outside in these areas. Those are maneuver areas, and in those that's where we allow the people. So we see the strikers and some of the air vehicles, and some of these are bivouac areas. There's no, unexploded ordnance or any other hazard out there, or DU or any of that.
After decades, the Army finally admitted to using depleted uranium in the 1960s in the spotting rounds used in the then classified Davy Crockett weapons systems. They say they no longer use those weapons at the range.
The Army had an atomic energy license from 1958 to 1977. Which covered the area that we're talking about from 1962 to 65 here in Hawaii. And that license not only allowed the Army to manufacture these rounds, but it also allowed us the capability to distribute to field units for firing, and that included training, like we would have had here up at Pohakuloa.
The media was also shown the area where the spotting rounds were fired.
What we've got, I don't know if you can see, there's a steel target here that's that kind of tannish color, all the way to the just past the building here would be the arc of where the 11 Tango range boundary is. Right up past that road is where we found some of the depleted uranium out there, straight out here.
After the press briefing, the Army met with selected members of the community on base to discuss the assessment. Despite attempts to assure the public that there is no imminent health threat from the DU, some members of the local community have voiced their outrage. Outside the base, the usual cast of PTA opponents and supporters faced off on either side of Saddle Road.
A lot of people are concerned about the depleted uranium up here.
Okay.
We think there may be as many 2,000 depleted uranium spotting rounds. The Army is saying, well, we only found a few fragments, but there's several lines of evidence that there might be 2,000. If you look at the training manuals for the era, we're being interrupted by the protest of the Eagles across the street. If you look at the training manuals for when the spotting rounds were used, for the soldiers to qualify to shoot these things, they would have had to have 2,000 spotting rounds.
We're here today to counter the protesters you've seen across the street who've come out here many times to blame and defame our uniformed armed services members, calling them names, calling them dirty bums, bidding them to get off the Big Island, not to train here, with a whole host of various reasons. The current reason is they claim that Pohakuloa ranges are contaminated with depleted uranium, which is a much pumped up fallacy.
The Army has also submitted a license application to the NRC to possess the residual DU in the impact area after the fact.
I want to welcome you all here today. As Dennis Drake, our public affairs officer, told you, you're here at Pohakuloa training area and we're out on range 11 Tango. And really the purpose is to afford you an opportunity to understand the process that we have gone through as we unfold today and release the baseline human health risk assessment for depleted uranium. Just a couple folks that are here to assist you in understanding this and the dialogue, and I just want to introduce them to you. First is a gentleman here to my right, Mr. Greg Comp. He's from the United States Army Safety Center, and he's a radiation safety officer. Over here is Lieutenant Colonel Chris Niles. He's the garrison commander for Pohakuloa training area. He lives and works here, and his responsibility is to provide and upkeep this training area for all the soldiers and Marines that train here on Pohakuloa. Behind you is Dr. Bob Cherry. He is from the Installation Management Command, also a specialist in radiation safety. Mr. Greg Miller from Camara Services has done a lot of the field work for us. And then Dr. Morrow, who's done some of the air monitoring for us. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Mr. Comp, who's going to talk to you now.
Okay, what we wanted to do, like the Colonel said, and I am Greg Comp from the Army Safety Office, and what we want to do is give you a little bit of an overview of Pohakuloa, where things happen up here, and give you a chance to also look out over the range and point out to you on the ground. First thing we want to do is using the map, making sure we understand exactly what's going on here. And you know, the military maps are always the same, so they provide you go to any place, you're going to see some sort of red boundary. That's our impact area. Anytime, so we're firing all the heavy ordnance into here, and those are typically, no man land. We don't let people in those areas, except for, scheduled maintenance of targets and things like that. Outside of that, you've got another area. This is outside in these areas. Those are maneuver areas, and in those steps, that's where we allow the people. So we see the strikers and some of the air vehicles, and some of these are bivouac areas. There's no, unexploded ordnance or any other hazard out there, or DU or any of that, and so that's where the people are. On the border, we've got different ranges, and one of the things I wanted to take this time to point out now is, the Army's fairly rigid in the way we set up our ranges. They're always designed a certain way for the caliber of weapon that we're using. In this case, when we started this project back in 1958-60, they came out and they looked for ranges that would fit the Davy Crockett weapon system. They wanted something with ranges of about 2,000 meters to 4,000 meters and had the right type of terrain. They also wanted to have some secure both firing points and impact areas for national security reasons. We really didn't want the range of the weapon being out published. So we take that information, we go back to the range regs at the time, and that tells us about where the Davy Crockett would have been fired from and where it would have landed. So we had about 7 or 8 locations in the archive search report that were possibilities. And we came out here then on field sites and narrowed them down to, the 3 primary ranges or 4 primary ranges we have here. I'm sure you're not going to pick up these exactly on camera, but the primary area is here at 11 Tango. And we'll turn around a little bit. That's essentially directly behind you. But we think from the evidence we've got is the firing point is here and it's fired out this way in toward this area. So what you've got, and we'll show you a picture a little bit later on during the briefing, but the rounds would have dropped into this area here. And so when we came out here and we did scoping surveys, that's exactly what we found. We're able to fly over, find the pistons, and a little bit later we're able to find the pistons here, backtrack to a firing point, and then forward track out to where the DU would have landed. And it pretty well corresponded with some targets we had out there. So that's the basic setup of range, what you'll find in most places. And when we've done surveys, and there's the arcs here where the DU boundary would have been. As you can see, those are outside the primary bombing box. That's been one of the questions we've had up at Pohakuloa. We had a couple of arcs that may have infringed a little bit, so we put additional buffer areas up there just to make sure that none of the aerial bombing that happens would hit any of the DU rounds. And we did that fairly early in the process. First things we did, as we found the rounds on Schofield in 2005, and it was part of a range clearance process. We're out there, and somebody with older gentleman with some experience saw them, recognized that they were depleted uranium rounds. So we went back, we started doing some historical analysis, and in fact, recently we did a little bit more looking at the license, and what we found was the Army had an atomic energy license from 1958 to 1977, which covered the area that we're talking about from 1962 to 65 here in Hawaii. And that license not only allowed the Army to manufacture these rounds, but it also allowed us the capability to distribute to field units for firing, and that included training, like we would have had here up at Pohakuloa. So first thing I want to point out, it was an authorized use for us to do up here at Pohakuloa. So once we found the rounds, then, and we found out the history, we commissioned what's called an archive search report. And that went back through all the old range regs, all the Army regulations. We talked about where these rounds could have hit. And we came up about those points I mentioned earlier with the ranges. And then we came out with a scoping survey, and it was pretty easy. When you first got up here, it's pretty obvious we weren't going to be able to do much for ground survey out here. As if you've ever been on this terrain, it's very difficult to walk on, and whether it be the Aha or Poihoi, where you've got other hazards with cracks and lava tubes and so on. We weren't going to be able to do a full ground survey. So what we did is we surveyed what we could, and we actually found a round intact. And the one we used at Schofield Range, when we did our first characterization or media event, would let you know that we were getting about ready to start the survey. We used that round out in that media event. I forgot where it was. So the scoping survey, we came out, we also decided we need to do some aerial. So first thing we did during scoping survey is we went out and we flew aerial and we found the pistons. So that identified, we could look in here and find about where the pistons were. And from where the pistons were, that's where we directed our survey team and found the round I talked about. But we knew we weren't going to be able to do a good characterization survey that way. So we came up with the idea of using an aerial platform. And that's one that we came out here last year, last year in 2009, and did aerial surveys with that. We first tested out at Schofield. We knew where the DU was at Schofield. We did a good air-ground correlation. So what we saw in the air, or had on ground, we could see in the air. Then we took that data back and matched it, refined the analysis a little bit, and brought it over here and flew Pohakuloa. And we covered about 600 to 900 acres of aerial survey, and we really could not find any hotspots of DU, which means there weren't large clumps or targeting of DU. So that tells us, that's probably not a lot was fired up here at Pohakuloa. We see a lot more at Schofield from the same type of survey. So our guess is the majority of it probably fired over there, not over here. But we also took soil samples at that time, and Dr. Morrow has had an air sampling program in place for a couple of years. First thing he did, there was a set of dust samples we did looking at total suspended particulates. We were able to get all those filters and take them back to the lab and count for uranium. That showed us where we thought we would be, and it was really right at the detect limit or below for uranium. And then we also had him come out and say, well, what if we were stirring up dust during additional striker or additional training? So we had him come out and do another year study, which is still ongoing. We're a little bit past a year now, looking for those particulates. And those particulates we're not finding anything in those air samples either. So we take that data, the soil samples, all that, and we ran them in through the standard risk models. We use ResRad models and looked at that, and they are orders of magnitude well below what the EPA and NRC considers to be a risk to either humans or the environment. So what we're coming out to do today is basically give you that report and show you what the levels came out to be and how they were so low. And that's the same thing we did at Schofield a year ago. Okay.
So you're basically saying everything is okay, and there's no risk, or
Yeah, what you do when you're looking at these things, the NRC and the EPA establish guidelines for us. And if we're well within those guidelines, that tells us we're well within the acceptable risk for any radionuclide. And out here, we're at the detect level. We're right at the background level here. So it's obviously not a high health hazard here.
Can you describe, you use the term of finding pistons. Can you tell
Right.
me what that means?
Yeah, one of the things that you'll have, these weapon systems, I wish I had the visual out here to show you, but the weapon system itself used a round about this big around, okay? Well, if you're just to design a man-portable weapon, that would have been very, very heavy you wouldn't be able to man-pack it. So what we did is the Army came up with a technique where they put a small diameter round or weapon system, put a piston in, and then put the projectile on top of it. So it was the explosive went in the back. It's really hard without a training aid here, but you had the explosive in the back that shot out this piston with the projectile in front. As that left, there's a great picture if you're going to be at the briefing today that shows, I've gotten the backup material, but it allows you to see the piston dropping off. They drop off about 150 to 200 meters, right along the direction of flight. So if you can find that, you can go back to the firing point and then go see where the projectile will have landed. Now, that was for the large projectile. Now, to sight it in, underneath the gun, you had a 20 millimeter single bore rifle. A single shot, and that rifle shot out a small, it's just 20 millimeters, so it's about that big around, projectile that was filled with red phosphorus. That went out, hit the ground, and it's a very low trajectory weapon, and that would create a puff of smoke. That would tell the gunner whether or not he was on target. Then he would either just left, right, long, or short to get back on target. And if it's close, he'd just fire the practice round. And so that's the system. And on this system, the short range system, they used depleted uranium because they needed the weight to get the same trajectory as the projectile.
So the depleted uranium was on the tracer?
Well, yeah, it was a spotting round. Yeah.
The spotting round.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was simply a chunk of hollowed out depleted uranium that had red phosphorus inside of it.
And at what time was the Army using this?
In Hawaii, we used this from 1962 to 1965 when the 25th was here. In 1965, the 25th deployed to Vietnam, and there wouldn't have been anybody here to fire after that. So we believe there's only a 3-year window for the weapon system.
And do you know how many rounds were fired? Do you have an estimate?
Well, yeah, we've tracked shipping records. Shipping records show us that 714 rounds were shipped to Oahu. Okay, those 714 rounds would have been used both on Schofield and Pohakuloa. Unfortunately, we can't tell you how many rounds. We did also do the math, and that says if you have, 2 squads, 3 squads, whatever they have posted here, firing, 15 weapons, you would have fired a certain number of rounds. And those 3 years would have come out to in the neighborhood of, 1,600 rounds. So, but, if you're only shipped 714 rounds, that's what you fire. Just like if you have drink a 6-pack of Coke, you can't drink the 7th.
And why isn't this type of weapon used anymore?
Well, it was a Cold War weapon, and it was only designed as a last resort to stop, an invading army. We used it a lot in Fulda Gap, protecting Germany was a primary place for that weapon. And new weapon systems came along, and we also decided that it was really not a very effective weapon. You would have lost the crew probably if you'd have fired it because of the short range. It was about 1 KT nuclear weapon, and if you're 2,000 meters from that, that'd been pretty dangerous if you're the fires.
Did any soldiers suffer ill health effects after using this weapon?
No, the depleted uranium that's in it, when depleted uranium is a solid metal, it's not going to come off you besides in a brass casing. So you would have handled brass, not the depleted uranium. So there would have been, minimal, if any, exposure to the DU to the soldier.
Is there any studies going on to look at the people who worked with these materials?
Well, DOE's got ongoing studies on that. We've done health effect studies for closing out areas where they were manufactured. 44,000 of these were demilled at Lake City, and so there were studies done there. But yeah, there's been no health effects that we've been able to determine.
And
you mentioned that there was a license for the use of it
Right.
in Hawaii. Do you have some more information about that? Or
Sure. One of the things that happened, we saw the initial license when we first found this as part of the archive search report. Last year or earlier this year, when the 2.206 petition was filed with the NRC, we went back and did some more historical research. We were able to find records that trace the history of that license from the very inception. In fact, I've got the early project management manuals from it, all the way until the project was closed down and in the late 60s. In fact, the license itself was continued on because we were looking at other potential depleted uranium, so it continued on until 1977. But we can trace that license history. There are about 8 or 9 amendments between 1960 and 1977.
it specifically mentioned the research that was going on in Hawaii then?
No. What it mentioned for Hawaii, the license says the Army is authorized to manufacture and distribute to field units for training.
Available, generally anytime we write about this,
Right.
people call up and they want to see
Yeah.
a piece of paperwork.
Yeah.
Is that something that we can get a copy of?
Well, right now it's available I think in the NRC archives.
Okay.
Those will be, we're in process with this application of making sure the NRC understands, and I think we had a few more documents in the NRC, and so we will be providing those, and they can probably provide it at the same time. Yeah. Let me back up. That does bring up a good point, Dennis. You asked about the license itself. One of the things we found when we're going through the historical review of the license is the NRC, initially it was the Atomic Energy Commission, and now it's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And the AEC actually knew about this. I have inspection reports from them, and as it transitions to the NRC, there were the inspectors, noted that it was being distributed to field units for use. So we're sure and we're positive, there's full disclosure on what we're doing with the rounds and distributing it. So we've got that. When the license was closed out, what we believe happened is the NRC looked at it and said, well, this isn't a health hazard. We've got a 1960 Army Health Physics report that kind of backs that up. So what we think we did, we closed out the manufacturing places, but we never picked back up and re-looked any of the field sites. We think it's because the NRC felt there wasn't a health and safety hazard from those rounds laying on the site. So advance forward now to 1995. When we found the rounds, it's like, okay, what are these things? It took us a year or so to figure out what we had and what the history. 2005. I'm sorry, 2005. Thank you, Dennis. So 2005, we find these. We figure out we have more than 15 pounds at Schofield, and so that's going to require a license. One of the first things we did, we called the NRC, Region 3, which is where our contract is being handled out of Rock Island, and later on we dealt with Region 4 and the NRC headquarters. But we had several conference calls with the NRCs, and they kind of said, well, we've got more than 15 pounds, we need to start this license application process. At the time we were still gathering data, so it took us another year to write the license. We finally submitted that in 2008. And so that was submitted in 2008 to the NRC. The NRC looked at it and says, well, we would like site-specific environmental monitoring plans. And since we've done the work at Schofield and Pohakuloa, we actually wrote the 2 environmental monitoring plans based on those 2 sites. The NRC has all that information. We're now waiting for them to reply back to us. I think we did public hearings last year here and over at Schofield. And in fact, we did one Kona and Hilo while we were over here. And that was part of the licensing process. And then we had the ASLB hearing, Atomic Safety Licensing Board hearing, that was brought up. And then we had a 2.206 hearing. So I think that has delayed some of the NRC response. We're expecting them to respond back within, by the end of the year, first part of next year, to provide us the license, or at least some more give and take on if they need more information. So that's kind of where we're at right now. It's in the NRC's court, and we're just waiting for them to answer.
I'm good.
Okay.
Good. I have another question.
Okay, sure.
You had mentioned background levels. Do
Right.
levels. Can you just define what that means, or like explain what that means a little bit more?
Sure. Naturally, you're going to have a certain amount of all minerals in the earth crust are going to be there naturally. Hawaii does have a fairly low background with uranium, so that does help us in a way. It helps us find it. If we had it out here, it should be easier for us to find depleted uranium because of those nice low natural background levels. So there's levels that we can see out in the field that those are called detection levels. We take the same thing if I take air samples and collect dirt on a filter, or we take soil samples, we take them back to a lab. There's a certain level at below those machines can't read, and that's the detection level.
I wanted to close before we go out on the range that since the inception of this program, when we found the depleted uranium and the Army issued its 4-point plan, we've been committed to open and honest communication, working in partnership with the State Department of Health as well as federal regulators. And so we are obligated and we are absolutely committed to doing that, to meet all of our regulatory guidance as well as our statutory guidance, so that in the end, we can continue to train our Army and Marine Corps forces that need to train here, still being good stewards of the land, and most especially good neighbors for the people of the Big Island. So that's why we greatly appreciate you coming up here today to see on the ground what it is we're doing to continue to maintain this vital training area for the Department of Defense. Thank you.
The question was just to ask about the natural radioactivity of depleted uranium. One thing I want to point out, it is much lower than natural uranium. What you do with natural uranium, you refine it, you actually pull out the highly radioactive stuff, and what you're left with is depleted uranium. And so it's much less radioactive than the naturally occurring uranium. The other part about that, since it's got such a long half-life, that means it's not very radioactive. That means it's not going anywhere. So you're not creating additional energy from those radioactive materials as it's laying out on the ground. The ground that's out there, if I had one speck out there, well, it's probably one speck's not a good idea, but if we had a pound of uranium out there, it would take 4.5 billion years for half of that to decay. So after that long time, you still have a half a pound out there. That means it took that long for that half a pound to go out, to go away and do anything. That means that half pound that didn't go anywhere is, I'm not saying this very well, am I? It's not there to cause any harm at all. It's so low radioactivity. That's like, if you think about it, if you got sand going through an hourglass, if you got a big hole going through the sand, dissipates quickly, that's going to hit out somebody very quickly. If it's just barely dripping, you're just not going to see it at all. So it's not very radioactive. It lasts a long time, and it's not going to be out there to create a harmful effect at these low concentrations, because as I mentioned, these are background levels. There's just not a lot of it out there. I didn't say.
And because of that, it can be used as shielding for really radioactive material. And
Yeah.
so the hazard level is so low with it.
Yeah.
It's so dense. It's denser than lead. It makes a very good shield for something that's
Yeah.
really hot radioactive.
Yeah, I didn't talk about all the
dangerous.
commercial applications, but a lot of airliners would use it as counterweights. In fact, the
Balanced
NRC rules on the counterweights is you don't even have to license that stuff. You'll have pounds of it as long as you mark it as depleted uranium. So you've got that type of use, like Jim mentioned, you've got it used in shielding. I had a teletherapy source where I had hundreds of pounds of DU that shielded, a few hundred curies of cobalt. So it's a very good shielding material for that reason, and it's relatively safe. It's just not going to go anywhere. So.